9 months went by after Charles I received news of his election as the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, before he was able to leave Spain with the coronation. He had found it all but impossible to get the Cortes to furnish money for the journey. Diego Columbus loaned him several thousand ducats and was rewarded with the title of viceroy, although Charles did not make the title hereditary. Both Diego and his brother Ferdinand were among the friends and retainers who were to accompany the newly elected emperor to the Netherlands, and from there to the German city of Aachen for the coronation. On May 20th, 1520, the day after Charles signed the agreement with Las Casas for the Indian reservation, they sailed from Coruña. Ferdinand Columbus looked forward with pleasure to purchasing books in the various cities of the Netherlands and Germany. So far, the books he had purchased outside of Spain had been in Rome, where he spent several months in 1512 while Julius II was still pope. He had been there again in 1516 and 1517, when it had been a joy to find the interest in books stimulated by Pope Leo X in the Vatican Library largely increased by the Medici collection. Not long after Charles and his court were established in Antwerp, a cardinal named Aleander arrived as ambassador from Pope Leo X, bringing a copy of the Papal Bull against Martin Luther. This had been signed on June 15, 1520, about a month after Charles had left Spain. Cardinal Aleander had his instructions to deliver the bull first to our beloved son Charles, Holy Roman Emperor and Catholic King of Spain, and then to spread copies throughout the Netherlands and southern Germany. Eck, meanwhile, was to deliver the bull to Martin Luther in Wittenberg and post it throughout the German states of the north. Since the number who sympathized with Luther was growing rapidly, neither ambassador relished the assignment. It was too much like stirring up a hornet's nest. Cardinal Aleander was well received by Charles, but with proper words for the occasion placed in his hands a copy of the bull, signed by Pope Leo X, sealed with the papal ring and bearing the arms of the Medici. Charles opened the handsome cover and read the first words, "Arise, O Lord, a wild boar has invaded thy vineyard." Surget Domina, arise, O Lord, were the words by which the bull was to be known. The text, which was fairly long, stated that Martin Luther was to have 60 days either to retract what he had written and be forgiven, or to be excommunicated and punished as a heretic. Charles promptly issued a decree against all Lutherans in the Netherlands, and Cardinal Aleander went on to Louvain. There, Luther's books were solemnly burned to ashes in a square near the university, which afforded grim satisfaction to the faculty members. The one outstanding exception was Erasmus, who decried it as an act of barbarism, a tragedy arising out of hatred of good learning and the stupidity of the monks. They can burn Luther's books, he said, but they cannot refute them. The university was then making life almost unbearable for Erasmus. Cardinal Aleander, the same irritating Aleander who had roomed with Erasmus in Venice 10 years ago, now attacked him in a violent speech on Monday, October 8th, the day Luther's books were burned. On Tuesday, Erasmus was dismissed from the faculty. On Sunday, the day before the fire, Erasmus autographed for a most appreciative guest a copy of his Anti-Barbary, his earliest book, the one in which he had lashed out for the first time against the barbarism of ignorance and superstition, of which this burning of books was striking evidence. The guest was Ferdinand Columbus, and the most prized possession which he took back with him to his library in Seville was this present from the most famous scholar of his age. On the flyleaf, Ferdinand wrote, half in Latin, half in Spanish, "The author gave me this book as appears on the 8th page. Erasmus Rotterdamus gave this as a present to Don Ferdinand Colon, Louvain, on Sunday, October 7th, 1520. Erasmus himself wrote the first 2 lines here with his own hand. 3 weeks later, on October 22nd, Ferdinand Columbus was entering Aachen, the old capital of Charlemagne, with Charles V. 5 German electors rode to meet the new emperor outside the city gates. At sunrise of the following day, October 23rd, 1520, as bells rang from every tower, he was escorted to the door of that cathedral where 3 archbishops waited to bless him as he entered. The lofty cathedral, lighted by 1,000 candles and torches, was filled with princes attired in cloth of gold, with massive gold chains set with precious stones about their neck. On a platform hung with gold and silver tissue sat the royal ladies, Queen Claude of France, Louise of Savoy, and most distinguished among them in her widow's cap, Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands. Long ago, her grandfather, Emperor Frederick III, had devised this motto from the initial letters AEIOU. All the world is subject to Austria. Here, on this day, in the coronation of her nephew Charles V, Margaret of Austria was seeing the fulfillment of that motto. During the solemn consecration, Charles lay prone on the altar steps, his arms outstretched in the form of a cross. After being anointed and taking his vow, he was clothed in the coronation robe. Then, with a sword at his side, the scepter in his hand, he was seated on the old stone throne, and the ancient iron crown of Charlemagne was placed upon his head. Albert, the Archbishop of Mainz, read a letter from Pope Leo X, according Charles the title, King of the Romans, the Emperor-elect. Later, Charles V was to have his title of Emperor confirmed in a coronation by the Pope, which also had been the custom for 7 centuries, ever since Pope Leo III had crowned the Emperor Charlemagne in the year 800. But, as Charlemagne had been the first German emperor to be crowned by the Pope, Charles V was to be the last. For the Middle Ages were past. The Roman Church, which had ruled and united Western Christendom for 1,000 years, had come to a breaking point. It had destroyed itself through corruption. A reformation within the Church was to come, but not before it was too late. God allowed this chastisement to come upon his Church because of the sins of the priests and prelates. Those were the words of Cardinal Adrian, the sincere, devout churchman from the Netherlands, who was to be the next pope. He was now acting as regent in Spain during the absence of the young emperor. Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, Uncle Frederick, as Charles called him, missed the coronation. On the way to Aachen, he was laid up in Cologne with an attack of gout. As he was a key figure in the fate of Martin Luther, both Charles and Cardinal Aleander came to Cologne to see him. On Saturday, November 3rd, Uncle Frederick brushed his bushy whiskers with extra vigor, put on his velvet hat, and leaning on a silver-headed cane, limped over to the cathedral to meet the young emperor in the sacristy. He asked Charles to promise that in regard to Luther he would follow the way of the law, and have him given a fair trial. Charles gave his solemn promise. On Sunday, November 4th, Cardinal Aleander called upon the old statesman at his lodgings in the Square of the Three Kings. He demanded that Luther be handed over for punishment without a trial, guilty of heresy. The old prince replied that he would not protect heresy, but neither would he deliver up any man for punishment without a fair trial. On Monday, November 5th, Frederick the Wise sent for Erasmus, who, as he knew, had come with Charles to Cologne. He wanted to make a first-hand appraisal of this famous man who was so inscrutable, so irritating to violent men on both sides. Erasmus, who had high regard for the benign, incorruptible old statesman, accepted the invitation gladly. A large open fire was burning as he entered. Erasmus stood with his back to it, warming his hands behind him as he spoke. Frederick asked him if he thought Luther had erred. Erasmus waited a moment, then, with an odd smile, said that Luther had erred on 2 points, in attacking the crown of the Pope and the bellies of the monks. Frederick laughed. Then Erasmus went on to say that Luther had been much too violent, that the honor of the Pope demanded this, but the cause of truth demanded that, until at the end of the interview he left his good host no less perplexed than when he had come. "What sort of man is Erasmus, anyway?" said Frederick the Wise to his secretary Spalatin. "One never knows where he stands." Meanwhile, the bitter smoke of burning books had reached Wittenberg. On October 10th, Eck had put the Papal Bull in the hands of Martin Luther, who, believing in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, declared, "Since they have burned my books, I shall burn theirs." On October 10th, his firm friend Melanchthon issued an invitation to the students and faculty of the University of Wittenberg to witness a burning of the Papal Bull and books of scholastic theology at 9 o'clock in the morning outside the Elster Gate. There, on an open space outside the walls, a great bonfire had been laid. When the crowd of students, professors, and townspeople had arrived, one of the professors kindled the pile. Luther first laid on the books, and then, solemnly placing the copy of the Papal Bull on the fire, spoke in Latin, consigning them to eternal flames. He waited until the fire had burned down, and then, with his friend Melanchthon and fellow monks, walked soberly back into town, leaving the students to dance around the fire singing funeral dirges at the top of their lungs. Frederick the Wise wrote to one of the counselors of Charles V about this retaliation. "After I left Cologne, Luther's books were burned, and also at Mainz. I have constantly insisted that his book should not be burnt. If he has now given tit for tat, I hope that his Imperial Majesty will graciously overlook it." The first act of His Imperial Majesty, Charles V, was to summon the princes of Germany to a diet to consider the case of Martin Luther. True to his own sense of justice, as well as to the promise he made to Frederick the Wise, Charles sent a courteous summons to Luther to appear before the diet to defend or retract his doctrines. The diet was to be held in April 1521 at Worms, a city on the Rhine about halfway between Cologne and Basel.